Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. To clarify, stating the obvious, this is not legal advice, this is not clinical advice, this is not medical writing or regulatory advice. I do these podcasts because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new each time, like with today's guest. So it would be nice to know if someone's listening. If you like what you hear, please like, leave a comment, please subscribe. If you want, you can find me on Darshan Talks on Twitter, or just go to our website at darshantalks.com. Today's podcast is awesome as always, but we have a special guest. And our special guest today is, and correct me if I'm wrong, CEO of Health Literacy. Is that how we do it? So how would you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Katina O'Leary. I'm the president and CEO at Health Literacy Media. We're a health literacy nonprofit in St. Louis, but we work around the world. We're a young nonprofit. We think of ourselves as sort of a scrappy startup that's hoping to transition to something stable over time. But we work hard with companies big and small to help them communicate better with the people they serve.
So I guess that takes away the rest of my introduction. But so if you are in medical writing, if you are trying to get the right medical writers, if you're trying to connect with patients and have a conversation, this might be exactly where you want to be, because you might hear more about how these conversations are taking place. Today's topic I really want to get into is the discussion on focus groups, because I think that's going to be really kind of interesting. But before we talk about that, Katina, let's talk a little bit about what you just said, which is you said that you see yourself as a scrappy startup. Is that fair? But when I think of the word startup, I think of someone who started like 2 weeks ago in their basement, has computers all around them. It's them, their dog, and some friend that they've fooled into being there with them. So I'm specifically thinking of Steve Jobs and Apple and how he started Apple, or Microsoft and Bill Gates and how he started that. But you're not a small company in that you're not two people trying to make do with something. You've been around for a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about that? How big are you guys? Who's there?
Yeah, so there are 13 of us. So we're not big and we're not small. We're right in the middle. I love that number. I love to be under 20. I find that when we get over about 20 people, we start to build in layers and hierarchical sort of hierarchical levels, and we lose touch with each other. We start to build things that we don't all have connections to necessarily. So that, 12 to 20 range of people makes me really happy, but we're pretty small. We think of ourselves as a startup that actually started 3 times. I think 3 is what we're counting. So we were formed by the Missouri Foundation for Health a little over a decade ago. And the purpose of the work that the foundation created us to do was to help raise the health literacy levels in Missouri. So our whole focus was to be a nonprofit funded by this foundation that really focused on Missouri partners. We were given money directly from the foundation, and we were allowed to use those resources to help people in Missouri. We could provide services to hospitals, clinics, education systems, anybody that had a health-related goal for free, right? That was our whole thing. We could go out and give them whatever they wanted. We could do talks. We could be in the community. We could build coalitions. We could host health literacy roundtables. We could do anything we wanted, and we had money to pay for it from the foundation, and it was fantastic. It was a lovely experience. We gave it all away for free. People wanted it. We were able to really sort of build capacity. We did things like hire journalists to put health literacy related news stories together and give those to newspapers all around the state. We worked with the health departments to collect data on health literacy levels among community populations. We were the sort of driving force for that. And then about 5 years into that first series of activities, the foundation leadership changed, and they shared with us that one of their goals was to shift how they funded other nonprofits. And they determined that it wasn't appropriate for them to continue to sort of seed nonprofits that weren't self-sufficient and sustainable. And so our job was to sort of recreate ourselves without their resources. So we were really lucky because they allowed us to have a transition period. So we had several years of transition where we had a diminishing annual infrastructure grant from the foundation. At the same time, they also allowed us to apply for grants from the foundation, which we hadn't been able to do before because we couldn't compete with other community agencies who didn't have our main resource for infrastructure support. So we started to apply for their grants, and what we realized is that there was no way we were going to convince all these people who'd been getting services for free in Missouri to pay for it. Like, that's just a non-starter. They'd gotten it for free for all those years. They had no money. They had no interest. They felt like they'd gotten what they needed, particularly when they didn't have a lot of resource to pay. So at that point, we determined with our board that we no longer had to also focus on the Missouri Foundation for Health catchment area. So when they gave us infrastructure money, we had to stay within their region. So then we all realized that Missouri's not our area anymore. Missouri is our area, but it's not our only area. So we started to push out the boundaries, and this is sort of version 2.0. So we started to figure out where are the opportunities to partner outside our Missouri community without stepping on the toes of our friends who are also doing health literacy work all over the country. So we didn't want to go out and go after other people's business in an ugly way, because we really try to be friendly in this space, and so do most of our partners. So we looked for states and communities where no one else was doing health literacy work, and we really started to build partnerships with large organizations around the country to help us support their work. So we were in sort of 2.0. We had a little bit of foundation money, and we started to build support from other industry. And that phase lasted for about 3 years. And we were just getting stable and coming out of that phase, and we hit COVID. So COVID happened, and everything sort of rolled back to sort of uncertainty and insecurity. But we've spent the last year really formalizing the internal structures that support our finances, making sure that our relationships with, banking partners and other things were really strong and stable, and building business continuously. And now not just in the U.S., but internationally. So we have global partners as well. So now we're finally on the other side of this transition, and we're able to support ourselves in a sustainable, rational, reasonable, not panic-inducing way. I don't wake up at night anymore worried about payroll. So, this is sort of version 3.0, and we're just now getting to the stable part where we feel like we're, a real company who can manage ourselves and be in charge of ourselves. And we're not just sort of, in a do-gooder role where we're trying to sort of support other people and sort of convince them to do health literacy. We feel like we're really, strong on our business practices as well as our internal practices that are related to our programs. Does that make any sense?
It does. It absolutely does. Let me ask you this question. You said that you're no longer in the do-gooder role. Most people would kill to be in a do-gooder role. However, you now work with what some people would say, and I disagree strongly, but some people would say the dark side. You work with pharma companies. What has that change, that difference meant for you as a small company going from we're trying to essentially give money away, give good data away, to where we need to be self-sufficient. We can't continuously be in the we'll pay for everything role. We need to work with pharma. What does that transition look like?
So there are a couple of things. First of all, I want to be clear. We still are in the do-gooders. So we're a bunch of public health do-gooders who mostly just want people to embrace this. However, when you're in that position of, trying to convince somebody to just take this on, and there's not so much value that you would even pay for it, it's a hard sell, because people think, well, if you're not charging for it, why is this important? Why is this good? You don't even believe in it enough to put a price tag on it. So it's a hard sell to convince people to integrate it. It's also precarious. So that feeling of at any moment, the foundation funding, the other support, the grant could fall, and you lose the ability to help all your partners. So, we want to be do-gooders. We absolutely are sort of these public health do-gooder nerd type folks, but there's a stability with working with larger partners, certainly, and having an institutionalized relationship with them as well. And, we really struggled with what it meant to transition to have more of a relationship with pharma. And as you say, the dark side for a long time. Some people on our board were concerned about how that changed who we are. Fundamentally, the way that I think about it is there are a lot of good people in pharma, a lot of good people that are trying really hard to do good things. Their expertise is often not in communication, and it's very often not in getting feedback from communities. because of the way that pharma and regulations work, there's often a firewall even. So they're not able to go talk to people and understand what people need to know and hear. We can help with that. As a function of the way that we work, we're able to ask questions that they can't ask. We're able to help them create materials that explain more clearly. We're able to insert ourselves in a facilitation role sometimes to help writers and directors and leaders in pharma who are trying to do really good push back against business folks and lawyers and other people who may have different, a different approach or a different level of concern. So we're able to help them think about things that maybe are beyond the conversation that they're having from a business perspective. So we're often providing the user feedback from the end user and the community that helps them say things like, well, just because the language has been challenged and been upheld by a court, these people are telling us they don't understand. And at some point that's gonna kick you in the bottom, right? You need to pay attention to this. And so we're really able to help them make things better and stronger and more clear. And I think that's our mission in a way. So if we can sort of bring good communication to medicine, we can make it safer, we can make it more transparent, we can help people feel more trust. We can generate transparency. There's a whole bunch of stuff that health literacy can do. I had a great conversation with a different group earlier this week, and they mentioned, like the buzzwords, patient centricity, things like that. These are all the buzzwords. And I said back to them, I think health literacy is a strategy to operationalize that buzzword, to really bring patient centricity to life and make that real and make it more than sort of cool jargon that industry uses to sort of feel good about it. So that's really what we're trying to do. And it's not changed how we think about our work in many ways, because we find those partners who are interested within pharma and other places, and we support them so it grows. But it's changed maybe the way we position sometimes. So we don't position as sort of a little company who's afraid to ask, and we don't talk about money and we don't think about those things. Now we sort of position like other companies do, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, that have a value around their work that's important for the work that you're doing too.
So let's explore that a little bit. I'm sorry, I really wanted to get to focus groups, but this is so interesting to me, just the way you operate. What I'm hearing you say, and again, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm hearing you say is that you're going into pharma companies and you're operationalizing patient centricity. And as part of that discussion, it's not just pharma companies. In fact, if anything, pharma companies were one of the different partners you've worked with. Who are the other types of partners? And do you find yourself acting as a bridge between patients and these partners, or partners and other partners?
Both. So we work with a ton of partners. So pharma is certainly one. We work with hospital systems. We work with state governments, public health groups in state government. We work with clinics that are large and small. We work with foundations. So I mentioned the focus group work that we've been actively working on in the past couple of weeks or months. That's with a foundation called Longevity Organization. And so the Longevity Foundation is completely focused on lung cancer related education and materials to support lung cancer patients or family members, people who are at risk. So all of those groups are our partners. And we absolutely at times bridge back to communities and the patients. But other times we bridge between partners, and partners bridge between us and other partners as well. So that's one of our strategies, is we try to be good partners. We're really interested in this work. When I mentioned being sort of public health, medical writer do-gooders, we get excited about this. And when we work with other people who are equally excited, they feel like we're excited about their work. These are good relationships. They want to introduce us to their friends. So we sort of keep growing in that way. It's very rare that we work with someone once and don't work with them again, and also don't work with people that they know. That's sort of the web that's built here. And even to the point when people leave their jobs and go to other companies, it's pretty frequent that within 3 or 6 months we'll get a call and say, okay, I'm at so-and-so now. We'd love to talk to you about what we did at so-and-so, because now we're here and they really need this too.
So one of the beauties of what you just mentioned is, instead of it being a bilateral relationship, there you go, a bilateral relationship between two organizations, you're actually working with a spider's web, where it's different connections that you weren't necessarily seeing when that initial connection was established. I guess my question for you, and this is speaking as to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. How often do you get that legal pushback? How often do you go, look, I recognize that there are some risks when you're having an off-label conversation. There are some risks when you are trying to almost semi market something, but it's not marketing. It's in that unknown space. It's not scientific discussion because that would be two scientists. It's not advertising because I'm not trying to sell you anything. It's somewhere in that middle public health space. How often do you see yourself fighting against lawyers? What are they usually saying? And what is your pushback, and how do you sort of, generally speaking, address this?
Yeah, so, I think it varies. The culture of the company really drives how often we hear from the lawyers. So early on when we worked with the state government, we heard from the lawyers a lot there. And they were really specific. We did notices and things that people get related to their benefits. So like, if people get food stamps, for example, they get a notice that gives them information. The lawyers are really persnickety about those notices. And again, these are the lawyers that say things like, well, this has been tested in a court. It's been upheld. This language works. Why would we change that?
Yeah.
So we spend a lot of time saying, why would you change it? Because people still don't understand it. So let's help you think about some other options. And that's a slow conversation. That's a really slow conversation. And it's not about the people. It's about the culture of state government and organizations like that. Things move slowly. There's a conservatism. And there's perhaps sometimes different opinions about who's the primary audience and who we're really working to please. In other companies, we see in a lot of our pharma partners, the conversations move very differently. So the lawyers will come in to sort of support conversations, but there's often a lot of pushback on things like informed consent. So when we start to talk about consent language, that's where we have a lot of concern and uncertainty. And what we find at times is that people will say, okay, it's fine. You can work on all of this part. All of this language is free and clear, but you may not touch this part. This part is the part that we hold sacred, and we're not going to allow anybody to mess with it. And at some point we may decide to do so, but this is off limits. And so what we ended up doing in those cases is we fix everything else. We give them recommendations about the language that they're holding to the side. And then we hope over time that it sort of moves. And one of the things we find is when we audience test, particularly after versions of consents where we've changed all the language that they allowed us to change, the only thing that patients and community members will speak out about is the language that they didn't let us touch. And then we get a lot of feedback about, why does this sound differently? This reads like in two voices. We don't understand what you're trying to say. You're trying to trick me here. The company's trying to trick me. What are you trying to hide? I was all in to do all this stuff. It didn't even matter to me that you were going to do these terrible things and this medicine is terrible and all these things. I was all in until I read this, and I thought, you're going to like hack my identity and steal my data. And I don't know what you're going to do to me, but I don't trust you anymore.
Yeah.
So we're able to sort of test that, give them examples of how that's perceived and what that means for their sort of brand identity, people's feelings about the company, people's feelings about participation. And that moves them a little bit often because they start to see like, oh, this has an impact, and people read this and they feel scared. And we've been able to share data too after fixing language like that and testing it, where people say things like, when they look at the same consent form and the language has been made friendly based on some of these health literacy principles, people say things like, I trust this company so much. I really want to be part of trials that they're sponsoring because I know that they have my best interest. You can do all that in a change of a couple words. And so that kind of data really changes lawyers' minds, right? Because their goal is to do good too, fundamentally. They're just afraid, a little more conservative.
That is so fascinating. Just a couple words. But are you doing this using focus groups? Or are you doing this as in it happens and then you're sort of responding and getting feedback? How is that usually working for you?
Yeah, so we do both. So we often, when we get to create materials, when we work on something like the informed consent, we typically ask for focus groups, and we typically ask to do 2 rounds. So if people can afford it, we suggest a round where we look at the current version and we get feedback from community members about what they have trouble with. and what the real challenges of the current version are. And then we use that version or that feedback to create an updated version that's health literate and accessible. When we come to agreement with all the internal powers that be about a version that's appropriate, we then try to go back and test that again with community members and get feedback again to see how the document's improved. And so that language we're able to share and give feedback. So this is really important when they've not allowed us to review the whole document, which happens a lot. But it's also important for the language that we create because, every company is different. Every community is different. When we start to think about little things that, we think make sense, we often hear from people, in my disease, my condition, that those words mean something else that feels really scary. We don't like the way you're talking about that. And so it's really important to be able to shift to that.
Now, what I'm hearing is sort of a one-way communication when you're talking about going towards the patient and you're asking for feedback from the patient. Do you find yourself using those same skills, that same technique to educate, for example, state governments and going, let me tell you more about sort of what you're thinking about and you're about to pass legislation on this. Here's what patients are really thinking. And so it's almost an advocacy role as opposed to or an educational role, as opposed to you hired me to do the job for you.
Yeah, I think there are some opportunities to do that in government. One of our, closest government relationships is here in Missouri. And I would just say, it's no secret if you look at the maps, the Missouri government's pretty conservative. And some of the values that are, very specific to our government and our leadership right now have less to do with, feedback from community members. And so while we like to provide that feedback, I think, there's more of a focus on personal responsibility and some other sort of code words that aren't connected necessarily to patient centricity or, public, sort of some of the public health good that we do. And I'm trying to be really polite about this, but there's some challenges with, there's some challenges politically with how people feel about these kinds of messages. And so, here locally, we get to do a lot of great work with people in the state government offices to help make materials more accessible, but moving the policy forward is maybe at a standstill. To be honest, like we're in Missouri right now, and the communities have had ballot initiatives twice to make a constitutional amendment related to Medicare expansion or Medicaid, I'm sorry, and the state government didn't fund it, right? So we're now in a lawsuit to try to figure out if the state's going to be forced to put money to Medicaid, given that the public has voted twice to do so. And we don't know what's going to happen, right? So that's context for the kind of work that we're trying to do. When we can't get money for Medicaid, when the data is really clear that Medicaid expansion saves lives and costs less and is an overall boon for a state based on all these other states that have done it before us, we still can't make that happen here.
Have you ever used your tools where you now take that information and make it understandable and bite-sized to state legislators to go, here's the data that supports expanding Medicaid? And how has that been received? I know you pointed out that there is a perception of sort of taking personal responsibility, but obviously there are different viewpoints to this whole situation. So how has that? And again, we're not pointing to any individual legislator or anything like that, but just in general, how has that been received?
Yeah, in Missouri, it's sort of a non-starter right now. It's just, what I would say is I'm not sure that people don't understand. I think that there are just political forces that are beyond individuals' willingness to consider anything outside some pretty specific viewpoints right now. These are smart people. I don't think that it's an issue of understanding. I'd like it to be an issue of understanding, and then we could just remove the blind spot. But the politics are really stark here right now.
Is it different in other states as best as you can tell? Or have you just never looked?
I think so. I think that there's a variability. If you look at the maps across the country for, any of a number of issues, I think, there are states that are more liberal and states that are more conservative. And Missouri's at the end of one of the most conservative states, right? Like we're very, very, very conservative, very fixed on those ideas. And we have a lot of challenges. We have, a lot of rural communities, farm communities, communities where there are some specific concerns about, rights that are maybe a little different than other communities. I'm a social worker. I think it's also fair to say, Missouri is conflicted and always has been. We're a community, we're a state that didn't really deal with, the reality of slavery. We're the Missouri Compromise, right? We didn't make our decision. We all feel differently here. We can't reconcile sort of who we are and how we feel about things as a state. And I think we're still struggling with the reality of being really divided, which makes things like this hard.
Fair enough. As you know, we usually aim for about 15 to 20 minutes. We're already well past that. Because you're just a great conversationalist. Do you mind if we ask you 4 questions? Okay.
Go for it.
The first question, based on our discussion, what is one question you'd like to ask the audience?
Oh, wow. I would love to know what my blind spot is here. So I'm a social worker. I have a really specific way of thinking about things. If I've got a blind spot here and we could do something better to move a conversation along and somebody's hearing it, I'd love to hear it. I would love to know.
I usually try to answer the question. I'm trying to go, do I know a blind spot you're speaking of? I don't think you have a blind spot. I think you have a perspective, and you're passionate about that perspective. And as you said, you're a very intelligent person. It's not that your perspective is wrong. It's just someone else has a different perspective. So I'm not sure you have a blind spot, but we'll see if the others agree or disagree.
Yeah. I don't know that I said I was intelligent. I think I said they were intelligent, but I think we're all smart people, right? That's exactly the thing.
You did say them, but I actually said that I think you're intelligent as well. That was my point. The second question I have, during this podcast, we ended up discussing a bunch of different things. One of the questions I would want to ask is, in the last week, what is something you've learned?
So I spent the last 3 or 4 days analyzing data from a series of focus groups that we collected, and we talked to patients and people who have lung cancer and who are having targeted therapies, immunotherapy. They're having some pretty cool treatments. And I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't thought about what that really meant for them. But to hear patients talk about what it's like to sort of go into the hospital for a cough that sounds like pneumonia and find out pretty quickly that they have stage 4 lung cancer, and then learn, okay, I've got this cancer, I need to figure out what to do. They go get a biomarker test often. The biomarker test says this is what your cancer is and this is how we treat it. And there's this whole other treatment approach that, has changed their life. So they've gone from you've got a little cough to you've got lung cancer, you may die, to, you've got this fantastic new therapy based on your genetics, your biomarkers. And, it's a game changer for people. And I just hadn't put that sequence together in my head. I was familiar with immunotherapies. I was familiar with biomarkers, but the reality of what that meant for a patient, one patient talked about, I went in to the emergency room. I got diagnosed while I was there. They had a sample, so they went ahead and did biomarker testing. We were asking about how you think about these medicines and how people make decisions and what they need to know. And he said, I didn't even think about it because it was, immunotherapy or a casket, right? Like I didn't even think about it. I very much thought that I would die. Everybody thought I would die. And here these years later, after using this medicine, I'm alive and healthy and not even, this is not the thing that defines me in any way whatsoever. Wow. I hadn't thought about that. And it was just so inspiring and so powerful.
That's amazing. I think it's this is a totally different pathway, but that's sort of the journey we all shared in the last year and a half, where we start off with COVID's going to kill everyone. There's hope to we're immunized and we don't have to worry about it. So it's a similar journey, but I imagine cancer is somehow more acute.
Yeah. I mean, I think thinking that you have a cold or pneumonia and finding out, you have stage 4 lung cancer, they say it's a jolting shock. And yeah. But anyway, so they've been fascinating stories. And every time I get a chance to hear real people, I think it's just such a gift. I love when people feel like they can tell us their stories and then use that to help us, explain things better and tell the story better to other people. And that's the whole goal is, we want to make sure we know from people who've really had an experience how to communicate this to other people who are at a different point in the journey.
You're a professional storyteller. That's awesome. Let me ask you this other question. What challenged you this month?
This is not really a work challenge necessarily, but we transitioned again. So my kids were in school all year and they're now out of school. So I've had the luxury of having a somewhat normal life. But my kids got out of school about 3 weeks ago. And while we were comfortable with them being in school, we aren't comfortable with sort of universal camps. My 9-year-old's not vaccinated. So getting back to this, like, okay, how am I going to work this summer and keep my kids engaged and do all the things I need to do and they need to do? I hadn't thought about that for a while. So it took me back to the beginning of COVID, actually, where I had to start to think about juggling again. And, I'm hearing all of these big companies say, things like you've got to get back to the office by September, or we're not going to give you the same salary, or, whatever these decisions are. And it brings up for me that we're not all in the same place. And we really are still at a point of being really sensitive to people's individual and family needs. Because based on all of these, specifics of people's, individual families and who can be vaccinated and who cannot, our ability to re-enter the world equally is not there yet.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to do a quick summary. So during this conversation, we landed up talking a little bit about how you are a quote-unquote scrappy startup with 20 people, with up to 20 people. You talked about how there are no hierarchies, and as per your experience, 12 to 20 is that magic number, if you will. You talked about the origination of health literacy, starting health literacy in Missouri, and then how you gave things away for free, including to journalists and to health departments. You then talked about you and your team's experience as being a professional do-gooder, which I thought was awesome. But then you had to work with what others consider the dark side, but not necessarily, and that's been your experience. If people are just trying to do good in many cases, yeah, maybe sometimes it doesn't work out as well as they'd want, but they're trying to do good. You talked about some of the roles you play, where you help in transparency, and you're helping different stakeholders, including hospitals and state governments and clinics and foundations. And you talked about how you're working with state governments, for example, to and sort of lawyers in the context of like benefit planning or informed consent, depending on who the audience is. You talked a little bit about the work you do with governments and the different perspectives. For example, in the case of Missouri, you have to battle against that perspective of personal responsibility. And you talked a little bit, very, very briefly, about focus groups, where you talked about how you do one and you use 2 different versions and you try to get 2 different meetings. But I think that's what I had. Did I miss anything?
No. Varied conversation as usual.
You're always a good conversationalist. Let me ask you this question. If people want to reach you and they want to work with you, how do they find you?
So you can go to our website, healthliteracy.media, health literacy, all one word, .media, or they can email me, coleary@healthliteracy.media.
Very, very cool. And if you want to reach me, you can find me on Twitter at Darshan Talks. Go to our website at darshantalks.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a comment, please subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. And if you like Katina, feel free to reach out to her because I think she's awesome. Katina, thank you so much for coming on again.
Thank you. It's fun talking to you.
Pleasure as always.